are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that's always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Daly and Kevin Laramie.
The Brazilian win, mate.
That's a terrific drive, mate. Really brilliant.
Hello and welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. My name is Mark Daly, and I'm joined tonight by Kevin Laramie. Kevin, you're back.
I am back.
You're functioning again, which is great to hear.
Yeah, we've been trying to do the show for the last 2 days, last two nights, but finally I've been able to talk now. Quite a Grand Prix that we had last Sunday, Mark. A last 20 laps that will maybe live in the anthology of this sport, depending on what type of career Max Verstappen continues to have. A great moment with Felipe Massa as well. And it started, let's just maybe start there, Mark. The Grand Prix started with a heartbreaker. Romain Grosjean with one of the equalizing the best qualification of Haas, crashing in the warm-up lap and not starting. Oh, that was just a heartbreaker.
It was. I felt very, very bad for Romain because he, like you say, he qualified in 7th position. And I figured that he was going to have a fairly good Grand Prix because rain is the big equalizer in Formula One. And you just had to think that maybe this was going to be one of the days where you saw one of these unusual Formula One results where you have one of the teams at the back of the grid, maybe a Renault, maybe a Sauber, or maybe even a Haas up there fighting for a podium. It didn't turn out that way. And the only thing that was sadder than watching Romain crash out on that formation lap, or that, not even the formation, well, I guess it was a formation lap because he was going around to the grid. But was his heartbreaking tweet that he sent out saying that he felt so sorry for his boys because that was heartbreaking. You know, they put all that work into it and they don't even make the start. And it was a pretty tough weekend for Haas because Gutierrez didn't make it to the end of the race. And I don't know if you saw that right at the very end there. He got into a bit of an altercation with Gunther Steiner in the garage there. He went in and he threw his gloves and he looked really upset. And a couple minutes they go back and looked like they were having a pretty good argument.
Gutierrez is not coming back with Haas, am I mistaken? Because you have Magnussen, who's going to drive for Haas next year.
That's correct.
And I think probably Grosjean is going to still be there. So 1 + 1 equals, maybe that's why Gutierrez was feeling the way he was, because not only did he finish the race, he knows he probably has one race left with Haas.
Well, that's just exactly, and you're 100% correct because Grosjean was confirmed to be coming back to Haas in 2017. Only, I believe, it was Thursday or Friday last week. So that was that seat confirmed. And then Magnussen, of course, wasn't going to take that 1-year contract to stay at Renault, what with Hülkenberg going there. So he took the other seat at Haas, and Gutierrez, I think he was obviously quite frustrated, but he wasn't the only one. I think everybody at some point, regardless if you were in a car, at home, or in the grandstands, that was just one of those races that, although it will be memorable in watching that charge of Max Verstappen coming from 16th up to 3rd in the space of 20 laps or whatever it was at the end there, but they did start delayed. They delayed the start by 10 minutes. Then they did, about half a dozen laps behind the safety car. And I thought to myself, well, gee, you know, if you're going to start and do 6 laps or 7 laps behind the safety car, why did you wait 10 minutes to begin with?
Wait 30, not 10. If you want to wait, might as well wait.
Yeah, well, that's it. It was either you wait till the rain pass or you just start on time and then go around with the safety car. Because I have to admit, though, that with the increased coverage that we get here in Canada now with the Sky Sports, that we get everything that they do on a race weekend, which is fantastic. But I've learned long ago that when it comes to recording a Grand Prix or any other sport for that matter, if it goes for X hours, I always add a little bit of extra time, but I always add an hour onto every Grand Prix. And I always figured, okay, well, that's going to be enough. So when I saw that they were going to do like the 10-minute delay at the start and then the safety car, I'm like, ooh, I don't know if that hour is going to be long enough. But fortunately, I recorded the other programs that come afterwards, like the pit lane and all these different programs they have afterwards. So I was fortunate enough that there was enough overlap, because I think I got to it was about 9 laps from the end, right in the middle of that Verstappen charge. And I thought, oh, this is great. You know, we've sat here all afternoon waiting for this thing to happen, and then I'm going to miss the best part, but it worked out in the end.
No, exactly. Well, it was close to not even finishing the laps too, because the way it works, there's a 4-hour window to do the race. But once you start the race, once it starts, it has to end 2 hours after that. So once they did the first lap around with the safety car, they had 2 hours at that point to finish the race. And it got to the minute left when they finished the 71st lap. At one point, everybody was sure that this race was going to finish by time and not by lap, but it got by the lap at the last exact minute of that 2-hour window, which it was fortunate, because if it wasn't the case, Max Verstappen would not have been probably on the podium with his last few laps that actually were the ones that were spectacular. One with the last overtake that he did on the curb, live on the radio while they're talking to Christian Horner with Sky Sports, and Max Verstappen is pulling it off. It was so spectacular, but that happened because it finally just got in all the laps, and it was, well, amazing, but we had to get to that amazing part, and it was quite long.
It was, and I remember sitting there watching the race, and of course, well, with the delays and the safety cars and the 2 red flags and the associated periods of nothing happening when they were all parked in the pit lane there, that when it actually got to the end and I realized, like I say, because I actually didn't watch it live. I watched it a little bit later on in the morning here in Vancouver. Anyways, when I was kind of watching it go along, and then when it got to the end, when I realized that the one recording that I'd been watching, it was 10 laps short, I was just like, gosh, we're getting so close. We might actually get the full 71 in. And then, of course, when I finished watching the last 10 laps and saw the entire thing, I thought to myself, even with all the delays and everything involved, it really didn't sink in that they actually got the 71 laps completely done. Of course, the lap at Interlagos is quite short, so they do actually tick them off fairly quickly once they get going. But it was very, very strange because, like we say, they were under the safety car for the first 6 laps. Then they got down to racing, and they did about, half a dozen laps. And then Marcus Ericsson put his Sauber into the wall, and that brought out the safety car again for another half a dozen laps. And no sooner had the safety car left the track and pulled back into the pit lane, he was coming back out the other end, because Kimi Räikkönen went off in almost the exact same spot, but had a bigger moment than Ericsson, and ended up pointing his Ferrari the wrong way down the start-finish straight, and was narrowly missed by Esteban Ocon in the manner. And that was probably the scarier, not just the scariest of those 2 incidents, but probably the scariest of the entire afternoon.
Well, Nico Rosberg had a scary moment too when he almost lost his car. I think it was the same straightaway too, and he got it back just in time to no damage at all, not even going off track. But what could have been, and that would have really changed the championship race if Nico Rosberg would have crashed at any point in this race, and Lewis Hamilton winning, it would have been a totally different story. But he kept the car on the track, got the second position. Let's talk about Max. I think he deserves it. It reminds me of a Senna in '83, or all those great moments we've seen drivers perform on the rain, like the Schumacher in his heyday. Great drivers get up in those conditions, and Max took advantage of his courage and his disregard for his own personal car, maybe. I don't know, but he got the job done.
Well, he certainly didn't seem to put off by the conditions because he was on the radio several times saying, yeah, the track's good enough to race. We should be racing. When they go to some other guys, Hamilton, I think, was quite happy with the grip that he had in his Mercedes. So he wanted to get racing, but lots of the other guys didn't want to. I think was a Felipe Nasr. It could have been that said that he didn't want to, that the conditions were pretty bad. But the thing
Look
about
at the drivers, though, the drivers who say the racetrack was fine is drivers that are not afraid to maybe sometimes take the chance or go for it. And look, the names, Hamilton, Verstappen, and look who didn't want to, Nasser. You see a little divide there. That maybe explains, like, look, if I know I can take advantage of the situation, we should. And if I know it's not my strong point, maybe we shouldn't. So there's always that agenda. It's when teams at the beginning of a race say, oh, should we start on a rolling start behind the safety car or a stop start? Some of them have an agenda too, because there's less risk and you don't want to crash. So teams always answer not necessarily what they think, but what it's best for them at that moment or that instant for a driver.
Well, definitely. The thing that was most impressive about Verstappen was that not only was he quick, but he was finding grip in that Red Bull that other cars weren't finding. I mean, he was going off of the beaten track, for lack of a better term. I mean, he was going off of the racing line into where there was probably more standing water, where there was more rain, more water running across the track, whatever it might be, depending where you are on the circuit. And he didn't really have any moments. Well, he did have a fairly big one later in the race. I'll get to that in a moment, but the moves that he made were impressive because they had that another safety car at one point. I've kind of forgotten them all here. I've sort of written them down, but it was about lap 30, I guess it was. Oh, well, it was after the red flag for Raikkonen. That's what it was. They did get the race started, and then they were behind the safety car again for several laps. And then when they started again about lap 30, 31, whatever it was, they did one lap, and then starting lap 32 or 33, they went down the straight, they went into the Senna S, and they go into the turn 3 there, Curva do Sol, I believe it is, and he passes Rosberg on the outside of the quarter and takes off. And I really wondered that if he kept going and if they didn't switch to the inters, because, well, I guess if you're Red Bull, you didn't really have anything to lose. You're miles ahead of Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship. Why not? Maybe the intermediates are going to be the tire to use. Anyways, that didn't work out, but I kind of wonder that if things were a little bit different, that perhaps he might have won that race. And if he had switched back to the full wet tires, maybe a couple of laps earlier, maybe he wasn't with he doesn't get the P3. He actually gets on the second step of the podium and puts Rosberg down to third, or who knows, maybe if he went in 10 laps earlier, maybe he's fighting with Hamilton at the front. There are so many things that could have happened, but I thought, poor guy, P16 after that pit stop. I'm like, that's it. That's his day done. But that's when the race got going. That's when it really started for me.
Yeah, and you're not the only one who were asking yourself that question, Mark. The engineers at Red Bull were asking themselves that question. So they made a little bit of calculation, and they took away and adjusted the lap time if you would have been in the wets the entire time instead of the inters and take off that pit stop. He would have finished second in front of Rosberg. All things being considered, overtaking and not having an accident and all that. But second he would not have been able to get enough time to catch Lewis, but enough to catch Nico.
Well, thank goodness that Max actually showed up and had that performance, because there wasn't really too many other things to talk about because, well, obviously there were the different accidents that involved Raikkonen, Ericsson, Grosjean, and Felipe Massa, and the near misses that we had of Nico Rosberg. It was all in that same one that I think was turn 15 there, where that really gentle left-handers, they come up the hill towards the start-finish line. But Hamilton wasn't really challenged the entire day. Rosberg obviously wasn't pushing it more than he needed to because obviously he didn't want to go off, and even that almost went wrong for him because he almost had that moment as well. and everybody else was just having problems keeping it on the track. The Ferraris were really bad in the rain. I mean, Raikkonen, he just lost it, I think, coming up that hill there, and just got onto the paint markings and spun out. And the next thing you know, he's spinning around backwards. And Vettel had a similar moment, and that's what it seemed to be like every time they got on those slippery paint markings, and they would lose the rear end. And Raikkonen was talking about it earlier this week, that the tires that they have now, the wet tires, I should say, just don't get rid of the water like they did 10 years ago. And I understand the caution, and I understand why they're doing it. And it makes sense, because 2 years ago, Jules Bianchi had that horrible accident in Japan at Suzuka, which ultimately cost him his life, sadly. And that was dreadful. So obviously safety of the drivers and of the marshals and the pit crews and everybody that's in the grandstands watching, that comes first. Obviously safety is number one, but I think that Kimi makes a good point. And I don't remember 5 or 10 years ago that when there was rain of any significance, and obviously it was raining pretty good at different times through the afternoon there, it seemed to get harder and softer and whatnot. But I don't remember in years gone by that just because there was rain of any magnitude that meant that they weren't going to be able to get the race started.
No, you're right. I don't know if it's because everything now is so technical and rain affects, I don't know. It's different time as well, different drivers. It's not as every driver that's used to the rain, because if you go to the other series, they don't always race in the rain, and you can actually come up the rankings and the systems as a driver and come to Formula One and not necessarily be that experienced in the rain. So there's always that aspect. I just was gonna say for Ferrari, quite disappointed by Ferrari. And now it's a season-long story of Ferrari never being there whenever they have an opportunity. Whenever it's either the McLaren, the Mercedes taking themselves out, or rain that leaves everybody with a little equalizer, Ferrari never seems to take advantage of those situations this year. And you would think with the pair of drivers they have, with the experience they have, they would take those advantages. But no, it seems like the car is either never up to par, or the driver make a mistake, or a combination of both. Arriva Bene plus Raikkonen and Vettel, right now it's not working. Let's face it, that combination doesn't seem to will result, and I don't think is going to do the same if it stays the same next year.
I totally agree with you. There is just something not working for whatever reason at Ferrari. And it's very disappointing, because you go back to the beginning of the year at Australia, and of course you figure that it's going to be Mercedes that are going to have the advantage, but Ferrari, they came into the year, and I think they were saying at that point that they were perhaps, maybe a tenth of a second off of the pace of the Mercedes. I think that's what the estimate was at that time. But
you're more to a second and a tenth right now.
Yeah, if they're lucky, right? But you have that first race in Melbourne, and ever since then, that was about as close as they got. Maybe a little bit in Bahrain, maybe a little bit in China. They kind of showed a little bit, and then they've slowly been regressing all year. And I think thankfully they have Raikkonen there, because he's had the better season of the two Ferrari drivers. And yeah, I don't know. What do you do if you're Ferrari next year? Like, something's got to give. I can't believe that a team with that amount of pride, that amount of funding, that amount of history, all the things that come with Ferrari, and also the politics and all that as well. That's part and parcel of Ferrari. But what gives? Are they going to remove, say, Arriva Bene and put somebody else in that maybe isn't Arriva Bene, but doesn't really have what it takes either? Is it just, do they not have the right people, the engineers and the designers and all those sorts of things? What is it? Is it just one or two little things, or is it more? It's hard to say, but if you're a fan of Ferrari, I think you have to be very, very disappointed, because there's one race now, and this could be the year that they don't win a single race. And let's face it, if you haven't been in a Red Bull or a Mercedes this year, then yeah, you've been out of luck.
No, exactly. And look at what Max Verstappen has contributed to Red Bull since joining Red Bull. The win, the podiums, the new fresh atmosphere, the fresh attitude, the look at me, I'm going to go do my best. I'm going to push people around. I'm going to rattle the cage, but everybody's going to be better for it. And that's the type of attitude that Verstappen has brought. Maybe I think Ferrari needs that. Ferrari needs a new kind of driver. And unfortunately, they already signed and committed to Raikkonen and Vettel for 2017. But they need that attitude. The only where you can change it now is at Rivabene. So they need somebody to take a Christian Horner type to take over for Rivabene to actually rattle that cage and make sure that they realize that maybe they're not on the right path. And next year is the time to do that now is the time to do that because of all the changes going into the car. So you need a new direction. They definitely need a new direction as well.
And, it's funny, just as you were talking there, I was thinking about Ferrari and Red Bull, and you kind of compare the two teams to one another. And doesn't it seem like completely opposite, like emotions, I guess, almost at Red Bull? They seem more lighthearted. They seem like they're enjoying it more. And then you get the opposite of that is the complete meltdown of Sebastian Vettel after the Mexican Grand Prix, telling everybody and his, I think that in race control to you go and do what to themselves. And that just to me seems like that sort of encapsulates the frustration of an entire season. I mean, they just haven't been competitive. There were the incidents with Danny Kvyat that knocked out Vettel a couple of times there at the beginning of the year, and just all these different things. And you look how last year it was kind of flipped around. Ferrari was a little bit more competitive. They got a couple of wins. And then Red Bull, they were struggling and they were fighting with Renault that they didn't want their rubbish engines. And they're talking about pulling out of Formula One and all these different things. And they've completely switched. Not only has Red Bull moved ahead of Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship, but they also seem to be enjoying themselves again. The Renault engine seems to be better than it was a year ago. Of course, it's branded as a Tag Heuer engine, and they just seem to be doing so much more. They kind of look a little bit more like the Red Bull of old. And well, who knows? I mean, next year, of course, is a complete unknown until we actually probably get to Australia in March and see all the cars together on the grid to see who's figured it out. But of course, they've only had a couple of wins here and there this year, but it's been refreshing to see them doing it, but also it is disappointing to see Ferrari struggle like they have been.
No, it is disappointing, but because of the way they're going, I don't see it changing unless they actually change something. They change drastically their direction, and that means for me, well, Arriva Bene, because it's the only movable piece right now in Ferrari. So.
Well, they do have one other option, of course. They could steal a Mercedes or a Red Bull and just paint it scarlet and throw a Ferrari badge on the front. Sure. But that might not be fooling anybody, though. But yeah, it is. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, yeah, they're going to get caught and it's going to be just worse. But I remember it being the only movable piece because, well, you already committed yourselves with the two drivers. So if you can't change the whole team, you change the coach. And in F1 terms, means Arriva Bene out.
Well, it kind of makes you wonder. Already McLaren this week has made the move to remove Ron Dennis as the chairman of the McLaren Technology Group, of which the Formula One team is a part. So I think he's still the majority shareholder, or one of them. I think he's got something like 25% of the shares in the company, but that is going to be so strange. I mean, I think that probably all of us here, or a vast majority of us, have probably grown up watching Ron Dennis on the pit wall or in the garage and at some point. And I know he sort of stepped aside there for a couple of years, several years back when Martin Whitmarsh took over, but that was quite surprising. So of course, that decision that was made by the board of the McLaren Technology Group is not completely because of what's happening in Formula One. There hasn't really been a reason publicly given. There's supposedly different rumors that fly around in the Formula One paddock, but of course it doesn't really dribble out into the public. But
here's one of the rumors, maybe. The partnership with Honda and McLaren is not going like anybody wants to be. The behind the scenes cooperation to get the most out of that partnership is not going as well as expected as well. And the pressure of that commitment by both sides could have been in the balance a big weight in the decision if Ron Dennis stays or go.
Well, it's amazing when you think the partnership between Honda and McLaren hasn't really borne fruit, I guess you could say, at this point. Of course, Honda was coming into the game several years behind everywhere else. I mean, you look at Mercedes, who was already in this project for several years before they switched to the new rules and regulations in 2014. And they've obviously dominated the last 3 seasons. It's either been Lewis Hamilton, Nico Rosberg, or, well, it was only going to be those two, or occasionally maybe a Ferrari or Red Bull that's going to win a Grand Prix. So the Honda, it's gotten a little bit better, but they're still lacking. They're just lacking what you would expect from a partnership from McLaren and Honda that was so dominant in the late 1980s and the 1990s. So that is also another thing that's disappointing to see. But so what happens now? They're going to have, I think, what do they call it now? Oh, an executive committee that is going to oversee everything for the time being while they look for a replacement for Ron Dennis. But yeah, they still have their work cut out for them. I mean, they're going to have a very good driver lineup next year. Stoffel van Dorn, very highly rated young Belgian driver, and a former world champion, double world champion in Fernando Alonso. So get these guys a good car and a reliable engine. I think at least this year they haven't had as many engine failures as they had last year because
it was reliable. It was just not fast enough.
Yeah, it's lacking the power. Exactly.
And well, it was kind of painful to watch Jenson Button in this race too. And it seems like he already is looking forward to his quote unquote sabbatical. And just watching him, his comments on the radio, yeah, he's really looking forward to the end of the season.
Some of the quotes that you hear from Jensen are just really amusing. I mean, you could just tell he's another guy that's fed up. But that's another situation I don't think we've really talked about until now, is I think it's so strange, the arrangement that they have, because Jensen's, 35 years old now? Something like that, right? So I mean,
But he always has raced, though. He was a teammate of Jacques Villeneuve, for crying out loud. He's been there forever.
Yeah, well, I remember watching Jensen race at the 2001 European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. That's when I went to go. That was the first Grand Prix I went to when I was in my early 20s, and Jensen was there, and here he is 15 years later. But it's a little bit strange the way that they've got this done, because Jensen, obviously, he signed, a 1-year contract to the end of last year. And then Fernando Alonso has a contract till the end of next year. And then they've got Van Dorn, who's obviously a very highly rated young driver, who basically said, I don't know if it was some sort of an ultimatum sort of thing, but I believe that he said that if they didn't give him a deal for 2017, then he'd be forced to look at his options somewhere else, because he should be racing in Formula One. And after you see him getting, what did he get in Bahrain? Was it a P10 or a P9? I know that he sort of snuck into the points there. I mean, for a guy that hasn't raced in Formula One and is only the test driver, the reserve driver, or whatever it is, I mean, that was exceptional to come in and take Alonso's car, because Alonso obviously was sitting that one out after he had that huge crash in Australia. So you don't want to let a hot young driver like that go. But on the other side, I mean, you've got two former world champions in Jenson Button and Fernando Alonso. You probably don't want to let them go either, because Alonso is still probably one of the best drivers on the grid, as is Jenson Button. The problem being, of course, is that the car hasn't been there. I'm not really sure how the chassis compares to other cars up and down the Formula One grid, but obviously the engine just hasn't had enough power. But that is obviously another interesting situation, and it's going to be fascinating to watch what happens this time next year, maybe as early as next summer, to see what's going to happen for 2018, because Jensen is supposed to stick around and help with the development of the car in theory. But then
Exactly.
what happens? Are we going to be playing musical chairs here, or another Formula One version of Three's Company next summer?
What if Alonso? We all remember what happened when the NBC announced that Conan O'Brien would take over for Jay Leno. Well, when the time came, Jay Leno didn't want to go. So now you're saying that Alonso is going to step away for Button to come back. Who knows? Maybe Alonso won't want to step away, and then they're stuck. Well, Van Dorn's doing better, so what do we do? Sorry, Jensen. There's only two cars, and we don't want you in it. So who knows what's going to happen in the year?
Yeah, and that's funny what you should say about the Leno comparison as well, and it could happen. But I think that we all thought that, and this kind of just goes back a little bit to the Ferrari discussion we were having a few minutes ago, and I think a lot of people, myself included, thought that Fernando was a little bit crazy to walk away from Ferrari at the end of the 2014 season and go to McLaren. I thought, well, why would you go from a team like Ferrari and go to a team like McLaren? Obviously, McLaren is a very successful team, but obviously the new partnership with Honda and the engine and all the teething problems that they were going to have with the car starting with in 2015. But I don't think that Alonso is maybe necessarily too disappointed or upset at having, or maybe even regrets that decision moving from Maranello to McLaren, because even though they've had their problems there, at least there seems to have been some progress. I mean, there's undoubtedly been progress from 2015 to 2016. It's just, where can they go for next year? I mean, the engines are going to be more or less the same, and McLaren do know how to design a good car. So will they get it right?
It is some improvement, Mark, but when you look at the budget of the team, when you look at the resource that they do have at their disposal, it's kind of maybe not the type of improvement that people are actually expecting. And all season long, they're still talking about how, well, maybe they're supposed to be a little further than they are, even with just the amount of resources. We're talking about soufflerie, we're talking about wind tunnels, we're talking about resources of engineers in both sides on McLaren and Honda. And that cooperation, that fruition just hasn't come, at least not in results. So now their eyes have been turned to 2017 for a little while, and especially with the Van Dorn situation now and Alonso, it's going to be interesting to see how a team like McLaren does have a history in this sport, a history of adapting fairly well to new results, not like a Williams, but fairly well in the history of the sport when rules do change. It's going to be interesting to see how they start afresh. It's going to be like a new start next year for them. They'll treat it as such, and hopefully they will get those results of the cooperation that they can do have, and that they do have, and that they can do.
Well, definitely. And I think it's interesting too, what you were just saying about like just not living up to the expectations. And when you see the amount of money that they have at their disposal, and you see some of the big sponsors that have their names and logos all over the side of their car, you have to make the assumption that their sponsors aren't too happy watching them fight out at the back of the grid. Although Alonso and Button have had some pretty good races here and there throughout the year, but still they got a long way to come. I was just kind of thinking, was it last year? under Van Gaal that Adidas were rumored to have said to Manchester United that they weren't happy with the way that the style of soccer that they were playing. And I always wonder what sort of input that sponsors have, regardless what sport it might be, right? Be it soccer or Formula One. But when there's that much money at stake and a big company like that, or Esso as their logo on the side of the McLaren, for example, do they voice their displeasure to the teams? And if they do they actually take that criticism or these misgivings or, I don't know, complaints to heart? And what can you really do? I mean, I guess if, when it comes to soccer, maybe you could change your coaching a little bit if you want to. There is that option available. But I mean, if you have a rubbish car that has a bad engine that's underpowered, there's not really a lot you can do with that, especially the way that you can't really develop the cars too much in the year. You know, you could they have like little updates and stuff like that, but it's not like you can just completely scrap it all and redesign it 3 races into the season, because you get to China and realize, well, you know, we've got a couple of races under our belt and our car sucks.
You can't call like Honda and be like, about that engine, you know what? Good effort, good try, but we're just gonna go get that Ferrari engine instead. No, you can't do that with season either.
Yeah, exactly right. Now we come to the interesting situation. For the second time in 3 years, they're going to be deciding the 2016 Formula One season in Abu Dhabi in just over a week's time. So the last time it was Rosberg not winning. Obviously, it was Hamilton that won it in 2014. Last year, Hamilton won the championship again, but that was wrapped up a little bit earlier it was in America, in the US Grand Prix, where they banged wheels at turn 1. And then that basically, I think after that, Lewis had won the championship. And then Rosberg went on that tear of winning the last 4 races last year, and then winning the first 3 late races this year. And now it seems to have been completely reversed. Obviously, nobody has been confirmed as champion, but almost a complete reversal after Japan. It's been all Lewis Hamilton leading Rosberg home. And I think Rosberg has just been doing what he's needed to do to really get the car home and try and keep his nose clean and live to fight another day, because he only needs to finish in second or third, even if Hamilton wins in Abu Dhabi. And it's going to be fascinating. They both made the same tire selections, and I think we're going to see more of the same. And I mean, that's a pretty quick circuit, and Mercedes has pretty much dominated there the last couple of years.
Like, Mercedes is going to win the race. The thing is, there's a fair probability that Lewis wins, but that's not even enough. You need Lewis to win, and you need somebody to maybe take Nico out of the race. That's how Lewis wins the championship. So there's a very fair chance of that happening. I think Nico does have the upper hand heading to Abu Dhabi, but it's going to be still an interesting race, because you never know what can happen in Abu Dhabi. It's that type of race as well. There is some unpredictability on that circuit, and if somebody just touches the wrong wheel at the wrong time and Nico's out, that's only one of the few chances that Hamilton will get it, because, well, Nico still has a buffer gap.
Well, it's true, and you make an excellent point. It basically, at this point, is Nico Rosberg's title to lose. Hamilton, he can do everything right. He can go in there and dominate the practice sessions, the qualifying. He can lead every lap from start to finish. But if Nico finishes in second or third, then it doesn't really matter. I mean, he can only do what he can do, and that's give his best and hope for a little bit of luck. Whereas if you're Nico Rosberg, you're going to go in there, do as much as you need to do, and get that podium finish, and just stay out of the way of somebody like Max Verstappen, which I think obviously he did in the rain when Max wanted to pass him. He just tried to stay out of his way, because I thought it was interesting in the previous 2 races in Mexico and in the USA, how Rosberg went into those at the start, went into the first corner. I talked about it last week with Chris Stevens, and he left the door open. And at Austin, it was Danny Ricciardo that barged his way through, and in Mexico, it was Verstappen that pushed his way past Rosberg as well and banged into him and pushed him onto the grass. And they were all complaining about that afterwards at Mercedes. And I thought at the same time, well, yeah, I mean, Max did try something that was a little ambitious. Obviously, he braked way too late and he did run into Rosberg. But at the same time, Rosberg, he didn't take a very defensive line into the corner. So I know he's trying to protect the car, but at the same time, when he's maybe trying to be too safe, he's actually inviting some of that to come to him. I guess it's the best way I can maybe describe it.
No, yeah. So it will be very, very fascinating because yeah, you're right. It's not worth the risk for Rosberg to hold on to his position long enough so Verstappen actually runs into him. You might just let it go and you're going to catch him later, or you might not even need to catch him. So that's interesting. It might leave the door open for somebody to take advantage of it next week. We'll see.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one thing we can say for sure, though, is that once they get to Abu Dhabi, that the rain probably won't be an issue. I'm pretty sure we're going to have.
Yeah, it's in the desert. We should be okay.
Yeah, we should have a dry race. I'd like to go there one of these days. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but they have Ferrari World, this theme park right there, and they have the big giant Formula One stylized roller coaster. It's absolutely amazing. It's supposed to simulate what it's like to drive in a Formula One car. So that's one of the things. Maybe next year we can take in the final Grand Prix of the year in Abu Dhabi. So let's see if we could make it happen. It probably won't, but
I know for sure the next year I'll see at least the end of the Formula E season.
That's true.
That's for sure.
That's right.
Yeah,
it will be cool. In my hometown, and I've actually been in contact on Twitter with Formula E itself. We'll be covering that race, Mark.
I sure hope that at one point that we could get it out here in Vancouver, because I think that Formula E is a very kind of Vancouver sort of thing. I think it goes with the lifestyle that we live out here on the West Coast. Yeah. And I think it's a very cool series. So that would be fun to watch. So yeah, that's going to be great. Lots of good things to look forward to next year. And can you believe it? Sorry?
I was going to say one thing I'm looking forward to next year when you look at it, with all the changes that's going to happen with the Van Dorn Stroll coming into F1, all the musical chairs, the new drivers. 2017 has the chance to be a season to remember. We had like 2016 touted as, the season of world champions. No, it wasn't really. Only two had a chance to win. And it wasn't because you had a world champion in 4 or 5 different teams, and you had more contenders than just Hamilton and Rosberg. But next year, though, it is truly up for debate who is going to be a contender or not. And the new kids, Verstappen, with experience heading to next year, Lance Stroll, Van Dorn, will maybe have something to say about who's going to be to beat in 2017.
It's going to be very exciting, and I'm especially looking forward to seeing what Lance Stroll can do. We've already seen a little bit of Stoffel Van Dorn, but of course, getting another Canadian driver into Formula One is going to be something to really look forward for us here. And it's kind of interesting too that what with an American team with Haas, that there isn't an American driver. Alexander Rossi came kind of close a couple of years ago, or was it last year that he? It was last year, I think, that he got a drive there at the end of the year. Maybe it was 2 years ago. Anyways.
Well, the appeal of NASCAR is still very big, right? The open wheel aspect of racing in the United States, the IRL is there. It's still big-ish, but it's not the appeal as a NASCAR has right now. And stock car racing is the in type of racing in North America.
Oh yeah, definitely. I remember when I was a kid growing up, just how huge IndyCar was. And well, the Indy 500 is a little bit different because I mean, I think that's always going to be a spectacle,
but even
on its own, right?
But even then, it's not what it used to be, Mark. It's the one weekend in the end of May that people care about our Indy Racing League. But outside of that, it lost a lot of its luster, unfortunately. And I remember back then, the Champ Car, IRL were battling. That battle cost a lot in the history of the sport in North America, but it was still more in vogue. Let's just put it that way. Then now NASCAR has become the more quote unquote in motor racing with all that culture of the race and the chase to the cup and I can keep up with the amount of race that they have, but that's the culture that's been changing a lot over the years.
Well, that's true. That schism that they had in IndyCar racing, what was it, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever it might have been. But ultimately it did hurt like open wheel racing in North America. And it was NASCAR that kind of came and picked up the pieces, because NASCAR has always been there. It's been very popular in its own right, but within the last 15 to 20 years, and especially probably in the last 10 years, it's become very, very popular. And not only Formula One and IndyCar, but just open wheel racing in general in North America, especially in the United States itself, has really fallen off the map a long ways. Of course, it probably would help that if they had their own team, which they do with Haas Racing, and Haas obviously has a very good reputation in other American racing series, but they would need, I would think, a superstar American driver, regardless of which team he's driving for. It doesn't matter if it be like a superstar American driver driving the Haas, but if it was driving a Ferrari or a Williams or Mercedes or whatever, I think that a big name American driver would really put it on the map there. So who knows? But
my point, they're all driving NASCARs because that's where the money is.
Oh yeah, definitely.
That's why you don't see a lot of American drivers in Formula One, because they're busy and they have found different ways. Definitely.
Well, even some former Formula One drivers have gone to NASCAR. Juan Pablo Montoya was there at one time, or he still is, isn't he?
No, he's in the RL. I think he's back.
Oh,
in
that's
the RL.
right. Yes, yeah, that's correct. Yeah, it was kind of a little bit surreal to see him doing the podium ceremony in Mexico a couple of weeks ago, and I thought, well, geez, he's really gotten kind of stocky over the years, because you couldn't race a Formula One car, and well, I mean, it's not that he's very overweight, but he definitely could not race in Formula One. He'd have to drop some pounds probably to fit in the cockpit for sure.
Yeah, that's the difference between a NASCAR driver and a F1 driver.
Definitely. Cool. Well, what else do we have tonight, or is that it?
I think that's pretty good for me, Mark. I'm looking forward to Abu Dhabi, but I do believe Nico will win this one.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting. It's one race, winner takes all, and it's kind of hard to believe this, what seems like a huge, massive, giant season, which has been 21 races by the time it's all said and done, is actually coming to a close. It seemed at some point it was like the season that would never end, just kind of maybe thinking back 2 or 3 months ago in the middle of the summer, and here we are. And it's kind of funny to think that they're still racing Formula One when I go out in my neighborhood and people are starting to put up Christmas decorations. So that kind of puts it into perspective a little bit. So as much as I'm going to miss it,
yeah, it started before Easter, Mark, and it finishes just before Christmas.
Yeah, exactly. And as much as I'm going to miss it, I think I'm ready to have a little bit of a break. But anyways, Kevin, before we go, just remind everybody where they can find you online and everything else that we're up to here on the Sports Podcasting Network.
You can follow me on Twitter at Kevin Laramie on Facebook, at SportsPodNet on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, everywhere. And you can find all the shows on sportspodcastingnetwork.com.
Very cool. And of course, if you want to follow this show, we're on Twitter as well at Scuderia F1 Pod. Also, we have our own Facebook page, which is exactly the same thing, Scuderia F1 Pod. Email, surprise, it's the same thing, scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. And that's it. That's all I got. Until next time, that's a wrap for both of us. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.
You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.